Addressing Ehrman's error. And now we are ready to see exactly where the error of David Hume and Bart Ehrman is. Bart Ehrman wrote, "Because historians can only say what probably happened, and a miracle of this kind is very improbable, the historian cannot say it probably happened." This argument against academics calling something a miracle is an old one, and it was first written by David Hume in his essay about miracles in the historical Jesus. In other words, when he talks about the resurrection of Jesus, the only factor he considers is the intrinsic probability of the resurrection by itself. He just ignores all of the other factors. And in terms of mathematics, that is a fallacy. Continuing addressing Ehrman's error. The probability of the resurrection could still be very high. Specifically, Dr. Ehrman ignores the crucial factors of the probability of the naturalistic alternatives to the resurrection, or bracket PR start bracket not R over B end bracket times start bracket E over B plus not R end bracket bracket. If these are low enough, they balance out any intrinsic improbability of the resurrection hypothesis. And we can see this by looking at the general form of the probability calculus. It has the form of x over x plus y, because the numerator is reproduced in the denominator, x over x plus y. Continuing, addressing Ehrman's error. X over x plus y. Now notice that as y moves closer to 0, the value of this ratio moves towards 1, which in probability theory means absolute certainty. Or in other words, a measure of 1 equals a fact. So what is really crucial here is the probability of y. And remember that y equals bracket PR start bracket not R over B end bracket times start bracket E over B plus not R end bracket bracket. And this equals the probability of the naturalistic alternatives to the resurrection. So Ehrman cannot just ignore these or present made-up theories in order to explain that the resurrection is improbable. He needs not only to tear down all of the evidence for the resurrection, but he needs to also build a positive case based on naturalistic alternatives. But that's not all. Notice that Dr. Ehrman just assumes that the probability of the resurrection on general knowledge is very low. But here I think he is confused. What, after all, is the resurrection hypothesis? It's the hypothesis that Jesus rose supernaturally from the dead. It is not the hypothesis that Jesus rose naturally from the dead. Continuing addressing Ehrman's error. Is the resurrection intrinsically improbable? The resurrection is that Jesus rose supernaturally from the dead, not that he rose naturally from the dead. The hypothesis that Jesus rose naturally from the dead is very improbable. But I see no reason whatsoever to think that it is improbable that God raised Jesus from the dead. In order to show that the supernatural resurrection hypothesis is improbable, you would have to show that God's existence is improbable. But Dr. Ehrman claims that the historian cannot speak on the existence of God. Therefore, he cannot say that God's existence is improbable. But if he can't say that, then he also cannot say that the resurrection of Jesus is improbable. So Dr. Ehrman's position is literally self-contradicting. Continuing addressing Ehrman's error. But it gets worse. There's another version of Dr. Ehrman's objection which is even more obviously wrong. Quote, "Since historians can establish only what probably happened in the past, they cannot show that miracles happened, since this would involve a contradiction, that the most improbable event is the most probable." The New Testament, A Historical Introduction, page 229. In truth, there's no contradiction here at all. We're talking about two different probabilities. The probability of the resurrection based on the general knowledge and the evidence is one. The other is the probability of the resurrection on general knowledge alone, and it is not surprising at all that the probability of the first might be very high, while the second might be very low. Mathematically, there is no contradiction at all. Today, modern scholars have no excuse for pushing forward such obviously incorrect logic.